Most discussions about the Second World War focus on weapon systems, armored divisions, air superiority, and industrial output. But honestly, one of the most quietly transformative innovations of the war was not a tank or a rifle. It was a fabric, a tightly woven cotton cloth developed decades earlier, refined under wartime pressure, and field-tested in the most unforgiving environments on Earth. It changed how soldiers survived heat, wind, and fatigue. It reshaped uniform design across multiple armies. And, its principles are still embedded in modern tactical clothing today. The fabric was called gabardine, and in its military form, it became one of the most consequential yet overlooked tools of 20th century warfare. This story begins not on the battlefield, but in the textile mills of Britain in the late 19th century, when climate, empire, and industrial innovation converged. Gabardine was originally invented in 1879 by Thomas Burberry. Unlike traditional wool or heavy canvas, gabardine was tightly woven before waterproofing rather than coated afterward. The yarn itself was treated, then woven in a steep twill pattern, creating a breathable but weather-resistant cloth. It shed rain without trapping sweat. It resisted wind without becoming stiff. In an era when soldiers often marched in heavy wool that absorbed water and retained heat, this was a radical improvement. Before the Second World War, gabardine had already proven itself in exploration. Polar expeditions, including those of Roald Amundsen and Ernest Shackleton, relied on it. These were not fashion choices, they were survival calculations. In sub-zero environments where sweat could freeze and wind could strip heat rapidly from the body, breathable wind resistance meant the difference between endurance and collapse. By the 1930s, military planners were paying attention. When war erupted in 1939, armies confronted an uncomfortable reality. Most standard-issue uniforms were designed for parade grounds or temperate climates. Heavy wool serge was durable, but it became waterlogged in rain and oppressive in heat. In North Africa, British troops initially wore uniforms that had been designed with European weather in mind. In the western desert, temperatures could swing from blistering heat during the day to cold winds at night. Sweat accumulated in thick wool during the day, then cooled rapidly after sunset, accelerating fatigue and illness. The British response was not immediate brilliance, but adaptation under pressure. Gabardine became central to the redesign of desert uniforms. Officers had already favoured gabardine for its lighter weight and tailored appearance, but during the North African campaign, it began to filter more broadly into military issue, particularly in the form of windproof smocks and trousers used by special units. This is where the story shifts from uniform aesthetics to battlefield function. The British Army's development of windproof garments for commandos and airborne troops during the war represented a turning point. These garments, often made from tightly woven cotton gabardine or similar high-density weaves, were not waterproof in the rubberized sense. Instead, they blocked wind while remaining breathable. In mountainous operations in Italy and the damp cold of northwest Europe, and in night raids along the Norwegian coast, windproof smocks reduced convective heat loss without trapping moisture. The key was understanding the body as a system. You see, a soldier under exertion generates heat and moisture. If clothing traps moisture, that moisture becomes a liability once activity slows down. In static positions, waiting for an assault or maybe observing from concealment, wet underlayers can rapidly chill the body. Gabardine's structure allowed perspiration vapor to escape while limiting wind penetration. It was not perfect, but it represented a move toward performance-based uniform design. German forces reached similar conclusions through different paths. The Wehrmacht's M40 and later field uniforms, though primarily wool, began incorporating more layered thinking. particularly in specialized units. But Germany's most significant textile innovation lay elsewhere, in camouflage patterns printed onto tightly woven fabrics designed for specific climates. The Eastern Front drove the lesson home brutally. Winters there punished inadequate clothing. The German army's failure to anticipate the severity of Soviet winter conditions in 1941 is often framed as a logistical oversight. But, it was also a textile failure. Wool uniforms froze stiff when saturated. Cotton liners, when poorly layered, trapped moisture. Soviet forces, though initially suffering severe shortages, increasingly relied on layered systems that included quilted cotton jackets, telegraikas, that balanced insulation and breathability. The lesson was not about a single fabric, but about fabric engineering as a strategic factor. In the Pacific theater, the equation shifted again. Heat, humidity, fungal infections, and constant rain created different demands. US forces initially deployed heavy wool uniforms in tropical environments. They quickly transitioned to lighter cotton fabrics, including herringbone twill utilities. While not gabardine per se, these garments were influenced by the same underlying principle: weave density and fiber treatment determine how fabric manages moisture and airflow. In jungle warfare, breathability and rapid drying became survival attributes. Prolonged dampness led to skin infections, trench foot, and reduced combat effectiveness. What gabardine represented during this period was a broader shift in military thinking. Uniforms were no longer simply standardized clothing. They became environmental tools. By the later years of the war, specialized garments proliferated. Windproof smocks for paratroopers, desert weight uniforms for North Africa, mountain gear for alpine operations. Each reflected a growing understanding that fabric performance directly influenced endurance, stealth, and morale. Soldiers who could regulate body temperature effectively required fewer medical interventions. They maintained alertness longer. They made better decisions under stress. After 1945, these lessons did not disappear. They became doctrine. The British windproof smock evolved into post-war combat smocks used in Korea and, beyond. The concept of layered clothing systems matured further during the Cold War. By the 1960s and 1970s, synthetic fabrics began to supplement and eventually replace traditional cotton gabardine in many roles. Nylon and polyester offered lighter weight and faster drying times. Later, waterproof breathable membranes like Gore-Tex would push the concept even further. Yet the principles that gabardine introduced remain intact. Tight weave, wind resistance without impermeability, moisture management as a core function. Even modern softshell jackets used by military and civilian survivalists reflect this lineage. They aim to balance protection and breathability rather than maximize one at the expense of the other. There is also a quieter lesson here about industrial capacity and strategic depth. Britain entered the war with a textile industry capable of adapting quickly. That capacity mattered. The ability to produce specialized fabrics at scale allowed for rapid field experimentation and distribution. Textile mills were as strategically relevant as steel foundries. In total war, supply chains for cloth could influence battlefield resilience as much as ammunition supply. For survival-minded viewers, the takeaway is not nostalgia for vintage cotton. It is recognition that clothing is equipment. In austere conditions, managing heat loss and moisture is foundational. Overemphasis on waterproofing without breathability leads to long-term vulnerability. Over-reliance on insulation without wind protection wastes energy. The soldiers of the Second World War learned these lessons through attrition. Modern outdoor industries have refined them, but not replaced them. Gabardine's story also underscores a broader historical truth. Innovation often hides in the mundane. The war's outcome was shaped not only by code-breaking and armored offensives, but by incremental improvements in boots, rations, and fabrics. The men who crossed the Rhine, held the line at El Alamein, or fought through the Ardennes, did so wearing garments shaped by industrial decisions made far from the front. When we examine war through this lens, it becomes less abstract. It becomes a study in systems, how material science intersects with human endurance, how environment shapes doctrine, how small design decisions accumulate into strategic advantage. The hidden World War II fabric that revolutionized soldier uniforms was not glamorous. It did not explode or roar, but it reduced wind chill on a cold ridge. It dried faster after a desert march. It allowed a soldier to sleep slightly warmer and wake slightly less exhausted. Across millions of individual moments, those margins mattered. Understanding this is not about romanticizing the past. It's really about recognizing that preparedness is often textile deep. The fabrics chosen in wartime reflected a growing respect for physiology, climate, and sustainability in prolonged conflict. Those lessons, well, they continue to shape military procurement and civilian survival gear today. Remembering these quieter innovations helps us see the war more clearly, not only as a clash of armies, but as a contest of adaptation. And adaptation, more often than not, begins with what a soldier wears against the skin. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond the obvious and into the material realities of war, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts and share this video. These overlooked details are where history becomes truly instructive,